This computer. Okay. I can edit all that out. Okay, share. I don't know why there's two of them.
Well, the left-hand one is the whole screen, I think. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know why we have
Oh,
this.
there
Okay. If you want to change, you just push up and down or move the.
Oh, I can just hit this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Here's
wow.
Here's Judith.
Here I am. Okay, and this is a very informal presentation, so if you want to stop me and ask questions, feel free. If I can answer them. If I can't, I'll say, that's a good question, like they always do on these presentations. Okay, well, this is about the 1901 oil discovery in Beaumont that was called the Spindletop oil boom, and it kind of set us on a petroleum century. The 20th century was definitely the petroleum century. So, okay, well, the thing is, the search for oil started a long time before 1901. Because even Native Americans in Texas used the crude oil and the water from the mineral springs for medicinal purposes, and they waterproofed their canoes with the crude petroleum that washed up on the beaches. And early Spanish settlers, there was one expedition that came ashore probably around Sabine Pass, and they found slabs of black bitumen, almost like pitch, washed up on the beach, and they would use them to caulk their ships. And as navigation of the Texas Gulf Coast developed, ship's captains spoke of a place just off Sabine Pass where they could ride out storms because the water remained calm. And this was a natural oil slick that was there, and it was caused by oil seeping up from the floor of the Gulf. And I don't know if you can see, if I point something out, do they see it? Or
can you? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you can see that. Oops, hang on. This is it. Actually, the pond itself would. Did you do something to make that arrow?
Oh, make the arrow? No, just move the.
Yeah, just move it. Okay. Here is the pond would actually move depending on the seeps and the currents and everything. So here's a map showing the old pond, and here's the new pond, and it's just offshore. And this is actually Sabine Pass, the pass itself, and here's the city of Sabine Pass. So it was a place they could actually take their ships to get them out of the rough waters of a storm. So, okay, and there were a lot of other indications. In the 1870s, two men, John Allen Veach and Stephen Jackson, both located their surveys in Hardin and Jefferson counties on or near mineral springs. And Veach's survey was near what was known then as Sour Springs Mound, but would later be called Spindletop. And they knew there was something valuable under the ground there. They just weren't exactly sure what. The oil industry in the United States actually began in 1859 when Edwin Drake drilled a well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And there are people who say, well, you know, Spindletop wasn't the first. No, it wasn't. Titusville was the first, what you'd call a really producing well. It wouldn't be considered a gusher today, but demand for oil at the time was for illumination and lubrication. They weren't using it for fuel. Industry still fueled with coal. Of course, the Civil War shut things down, but as soon as it ended, the search renewed again. And Texas just looked like a place that ought to have oil to some of these people. Dick Dowling, if you'll remember, he was actually commander of the Confederate forces at the Battle of Sabine Pass in 1863. And he returned to Houston after the war and leased land in Liberty, Hardin, Jefferson, and Angelina counties. But in 1867, he died of yellow fever. So that ended that. Now, a couple of years earlier, an AP Trowell of Liberty wrote somebody in Beaumont, George W. O'Brien, to buy all the land in Jefferson County with mineral waters on it because he predicted well, for them both, if they did. And then a Benjamin Taylor Cavanaugh claimed to have found an underground vein of oil with his mineraloger, which was a homemade divining device. And he leased land again near the Sour Springs Mound. In Hardin County, settlers noticed that hogs came out of the big thicket with oil all over their backs. And so they tried to drill there, but their equipment wasn't strong enough. So you had a lot of these people saying, yeah, there's oil, but they just aren't having any luck until 1866. A gentleman named Len Barrett, who lived in Nacogdoches County, he actually drilled Texas's first producing well at Oil Spring using a tripod rig. Can you see this? Why is it not doing? Do I need to put my finger down?
No.
Okay, it should just do it. Okay. Ah, I didn't turn it right. Whoops. Ah, wow. Oh, you did it. No, not quite. That's a tripod rig. You can see, it looks like a pyramid. And really, I'm not sure how the drilling process worked. I think they just kind of pounded something pointy into the ground like they did with some of the early cable tool things. So it was there, and it did produce, but just not a lot. Other wells were drilled successfully, just not gushers, in Waco, San Antonio. And in 1895, oh, Missy entered the waiting room. If you won't let her in. There you go. Somebody else is coming in. In 1895, a well was drilled in Sour Lake. And I don't know if you can see, but in the upper left-hand corner, there's the well, a derrick. And then in the front, let me see if I can, let me do it with that. I can do that better. There's the derrick, and here's a pipe, and the pipe is coming down here, and it is spewing oil. You can see just a black puddle. It's spewing oil into a ditch. And I'm assuming that's where they wanted it to go. But it was producing, but none of them were productive enough to justify the really wholesale drilling. And in the East, John D. Rockefeller still controlled Standard Oil, and he ruled the roost all over the country at that time. Well, in 1894, all water well drillers struck oil in Corsicana, Texas. Corsicana became Texas's first real oil boom town, with 47 wells producing 66,000 barrels of oil in the year 1897. And they utilized a new type of drilling that became the norm. It was rotary drilling, which is actually boring through the ground like a drill, like a brace and bit, rather than cable tool. That was the old way they did it. And that operated by smashing a weighted bit into a well hole. I can't imagine how that ever worked, but that's what they said. Okay, well, now we get into the Spindletop era and the story of it. And that story reads like a movie drama. It's got a cast of larger than life characters. You have first, oh wait, somebody else. No, I thought somebody else was coming in. Yeah. Patella Higgins was kind of the most dramatic of them all. He was proof that a person can always reform. He was a former real-life troublemaker. He would go around and terrorize African-American churches and just generally raise hell everywhere he knew how to do it. And in 1881, he got into a gunfight with the local city marshal. And the marshal actually was killed, and Higgins lost one of his arms. Higgins pled self-defense and was acquitted, probably because he was a hometown boy and the marshal was not. He really continued his wild ways. That's him on the left with his missing arm, the sleeve tucked behind him. If you will look, he has a long gun. He has a knife. He has at least one pistol, maybe two, in his belt, and his pocket is holding another gun. And his friend doesn't have quite as many, but almost. So he was still a wild man, and he worked in the lumber industry. He was and this always has boggled my mind, he was a one-armed man walking on log rafts in the river. The early lumber industry had log rafts that they floated down to the sawmills. He would dislodge jammed logs with a long handled hook spike called a peavey, and he couldn't swim. So you know that he had nerve, even if he didn't have good sense. This is a picture of the steamboat Laura. This is upstream at the Angelina, but it shows you what the log jams look like. One of those guys, that would be where Patella Higgins would be trying to dislodge it. Well, in 1885, he went to a church revival and he was born again. And he became as religious as he had been wild. And this is a picture of him with his Sunday school class of mostly girls, 12-year-old girls. Can you see that happening today? But he taught his Sunday school class, and sometimes he would take it to Sour Springs Mound. Remember, we mentioned that, where he entertained the girls by lighting the natural gas that came out of a hollow pole stuck in the ground, because Sour Springs Mound was a place where there were mineral springs. People would use, they would go out and drink the water or bathe in it or whatever. But people went out there and he took his Sunday school class. And he noticed red clay on his horse's hooves one day when he was riding around. And he decided to open a brick factory, but he learned that oil had higher heat, burned at higher heat, so it was much better than wood for baking brick. So he decided to look for oil. Conventional geology said there was no oil on the Gulf Coast, but Higgins disagreed, and he believed that Sour Springs Mound was actually a salt dome containing oil. Well, guess who turned out to be right? Anyway, Higgins approached other Beaumonters, including this George W. O'Brien, whom Trowell had urged to lease land and buy land around the mineral springs, and a gentleman named George W. Carroll, who was kind of the leading Baptist citizen of Beaumont. And they formed the Gladys City Company. And by the way, Higgins was reformed religiously. He was never wild again, but he was no less obnoxious. He was just an abrasive character. Whatever he believed he was right, and he would drive everybody crazy believing he was right. So several years and several unsuccessful wells later, Higgins was broke. The others were tired of failing wells and of listening to Higgins tell him that the drillers didn't know what they were doing. And Higgins finally had to sell his stock in the Gladys City Company, but he still believed there was oil on Sour Springs Mound. And there was somebody else who ultimately agreed with him. His name was Anthony Lucas. He was a diametric opposite of Patella Higgins. He was born on the Dalmatian coast in the Austrian Empire. He was cosmopolitan, refined, formally educated as an engineer. Ta-da! He entered the Austrian Navy, and while he was on leave in the United States, he decided to stay. He actually went AWOL, but later went back and was forgiven, always forgiven by the Austrian government. But he eventually became an American citizen, and he married an American named Caroline Fitzgerald, of Southern Belle. He was in Louisiana supervising salt mining operations on Avery Island when he found out about Sour Springs Mound. He came to Beaumont and began drilling, but ran into the same problems the earlier drillers had, which was inadequate equipment. Like Higgins, he ran out of money, but like Higgins, he refused to give up. He got outside financing for one last try from Pittsburgh financiers James Guffey and John Gailey excuse me, and he forewent his salary as a show of good faith. Gailey and Guffey actually went to the Mellon brothers, who were Pittsburgh bankers, to get their money. Okay, well, his wife, here's Caroline Lucas. She had unwavering faith in her husband, even when she had to sell their furniture to support the family. When he thought of giving up, in his words, Carrie stamped down her foot. At one point, the drillers considered abandoning the drill site at 870 feet because they found a tiny show of oil, and they thought, well, if that's all it's here, why go on? And Carrie Lucas reminded them that the contract said they should go at least 1,200 feet. And they did, and the rest is history, because that is where they found it. Okay, here were the ones we thought were the authors considered these guys our real heroes, the Hamill brothers. They were the drillers. Lucas hired these team of brothers from the Corsicana oil field. There's Jim on the top left, Al in the center, no, Kurt in the middle, and Al on the bottom right. And their co-worker, Peck Bird. I'll show a picture of him in a minute. In drilling the Lucas well, the Hamels faced obstacles that would have discouraged most others, but they just considered it part of their job. That was what they were supposed to do. They solved them with physical labor, ingenuity, and improvisation. They lived in a shack at the well site, enduring mosquitoes, cold weather, frogs in the food all the time, broken equipment, gas blowouts, 18-hour work shifts. Most amazing of all, they just took it all in stride. And we don't have a picture of Willie Henry. He was an African-American mule skinner, but this is a picture of an African-American teamster and his mule team, actually dredging for a tank, I think, at what became the Magnolia Refinery. But he hauled the wood slabs to fire the boiler that ran the Hamels drilling equipment. And he and another mule skinner hitched their mule teams to a Fresno, which is a scraper, and cleared the slush pit of sand, then plowed the bottom to stir up the mud. And then they drove cattle around and around in the pit to turn it into actual drilling mud, because they needed drilling mud to secure the sides of the well when they were boring. So he was all part of the story. And here is a picture of the Gusher, and the Gusher is definitely a main character in this story. This is a picture that had not ever been published before. It was taken by an individual at the well. That was his father and his brother or somebody out there. And you can see it's a person on horseback and a little boy on a much smaller horse. And we got that picture when we were riding John out of the hill. We were very grateful. Okay, so the Hamels spudded in the well on October 27th of 1900. And the next few months were just a story of frustration and slow progress. They ran into quicksand, or heaving sand, as they called it, at nearly every depth. And that would cause a hold of collapse. And as they got deeper, the gas pressure from the interior of the salt dome would push sand up the hole and caused even a blowout for a little while. During the drilling process, though, the Hamels with Lucas improvised a pile driver and a hollow drill shoe, a check valve, which was handmade of pine wood and canvas belting, and the aforementioned drilling mud. They also struck that minor oil sand at 870 feet. But all of this stuff they kind of invented on the spur of the moment. And as Al said later, we didn't even think about patenting any of it. We just used it and then threw it in the corner of the derrick until we needed it again, if we did. But on the morning of January 10th, 1901, they just had replaced the drill bit and they were running pipe back down the well when it began to spout mud, rocks, gas, and finally drill pipe over the top of the derrick while the crew ran for cover. And when things got a little quiet, Al Hamel, who was on duty that morning, looked down the hole, if you can believe this. Fortunately, it hadn't started gushing yet. He could see oil pulsating just below his head. It looked like it was breathing. And fortunately, he stepped back because very soon a roaring stream of crude oil shot through the top of the derrick and spouted over 150 feet high. So that was when the gusher actually came in. And it took center stage for the next 10 days, spouting an estimated nearly 1 million barrels of oil until the Hamels improvised an apparatus to cap it off. And that was a prototype of today's oil field Christmas tree that they install on a derrick. And if you'll see what they did, they improvised, they created a valve thing and they put it on railroad rails, not ties, but rails. And they got a horse to pull it across, and they pulled that they pull this part across the flow. See here's I'm always wanting to pull it right to the left, but it's pulling to the right. Here's the horse over here somewhere, and the horse pulls it across. And the tricky part is when they start pulling that whole device through the stream of oil, and it's not until they get the pipe dead center and then begin to secure it that they were able to, then the oil started flowing up through that pipe, and then they could use this valve to shut it down. And they did. And fortunately, nothing, the whole derrick could have just shattered to pieces during that time, but they didn't. So anyway, the news traveled all over the world the first day of the gusher, and Beaumont's population jumped from less than 10,000 to over 50,000. This is a train unloading at the Crosby Hotel downtown. The Houston Daily Post described the town as moving like an anthill. Excursion trains brought in thousands of people every day. And this is the Crosby Hotel Gallery. It was the hotel by the side of where the train stopped. And here are people reading the newspapers. And if you look in the back, the whole hotel gallery is divided up into little stalls. People are selling stock, they're selling land, they're selling maps. They're selling just about everything you can imagine, legal and otherwise. And you had long lines outside the restaurant. Enterprising housewives made sandwiches and pies and things and had their sons sell it on the street. A lot of merchants just set up their stalls along the street. Here's a map seller selling maps in front of a store at downtown Beaumont. Clean drinking water was a lot more expensive than whiskey, so a lot of them just drank whiskey. Hotels were rented for months in advance. People rented sleeping space in barns, on pool tables, and barber chairs. Oh, yeah. Hang on.
Okay.
There you go. In barber chairs, and here are, oops. Do you have to? What did we do?
James broke it.
Oh, okay. That's it. And you can see here tents for rent on a vacant lot downtown, lodging 50 cents, which was a pretty good bit of money at the time. If somebody had enough money, they could buy a ticket on the night train to Houston, and then they could sleep all the way over there and even sleep coming back before boarding the return train, and then to come back and continue with whatever business they were doing. Oil company stock sold all over town. A lot of it, of course, was phony. This, I honestly don't know. This is a Big Four oil company, and it may have been legitimate, but the picture is such a promotional thing. The guys all have on their dark suits or their fancy collared suits, and they all have on top hats or derbies, and they're standing in front of, 10 oil derricks. And so it makes you think, oh, this has got to be a prosperous oil company. So who knows? A small tract of land that once wouldn't bring $150 was sold for $20,000 right after the gusher, resold instantly for $50,000. And after the second gusher came in at Spindletop, thus proving that the field really was real, sold again for $100,000. So land just exploded. A 24-acre tract near Spindletop sold during the boom for $25,000. Owners of capped gushers would obligingly reopen them so prospective purchasers could watch the oil flow. By the end of 1901, over 500 land and oil corporations chartered by the state of Texas and hundreds more chartered in other states were operating in Beaumont. Spindletop acquired the nickname of Swindletop. By the end of 1901, the worst of the boom crowds had gone. Beaumont was quieter, but its population stabilized at about 20,000, which was still double its pre-gusher population. So, on the other hand, life at the oil field itself remained rough and chaotic. And this is one of my favorite shots. This is Spindletop in 1903. Look at the derricks. And of course, what happened was that Spindletop got over-drilled. And as Anthony Lucas said, the cow was milked too much and not wisely. And so, but you can see that. And you see the settlements, but there are also buildings and houses all in amongst the derricks. So anyway, Spindletop was rough like the mining towns, but unlike miners, oil field workers often brought their families. And this is just a picture of the drilling crew. And here is Peck Bird. he was the fourth driller on the Lucas Gusher. And I think he went to other companies, maybe did other wells, but he also died fairly young. And so he never made the name for himself that the Hamels did. But wives had to cook, clean, and wash clothes in the midst of all the oil and mud and try to rear children amid the violence, vice, the danger. They had to try to establish schools, churches, and acceptable recreation. And even so, the children knew more about adult life than most of their contemporaries. Because look, here's an oil field fire that happened, I think, in probably about March of that year. And it really burned out a huge part of the field. And that's when a lot of the people that were just kind of there, opportunists, moved to the next oil boom town as soon as they could. They moved to either Sour Lake or Saratoga or Batson. And but some they didn't really try. They kind of tried to keep housing separate. Here's Gladys City, the one that was officially named Gladys City after a little girl in Patilla Higgins's Sunday school class, and he wanted it to be a model city with no alcohol or anything else. Well, no, that didn't happen. And as you see, even trying to keep them separate, look at the two oil derricks that are there. Here's one here, and here's one here. And if you pull back and made the picture wider, I'm sure there'd be more. But there was the derricks and the houses and the boarding houses and saloons, gambling halls, bordellos, they were all together. Here's the log cabin saloon. It was in the part of the hill called Spindletop. Here's a boarding house. And if you look in the background on the right, you can just see all of the oil derricks behind. So they're not really that far away. Here's some kind of a ball game. I'm not sure what it is, but the ladies are all decked out to go play ball. And here, though, is a real live ice cream parlor. There's a model of that at the Gladys City Spindletop Museum. And this was one place that if they didn't want to go get drunk, they could go get ice cream. And here is a boarding house in Batson, one of the Hardin County oil fields. And it's Thanksgiving 1904, and you can see that everybody has cleaned up just as well as they possibly could. Okay, so what about the birth of the oil industry? Remember, I said things were still filled with coal. So there were huge quantities of oil, but the existing market was for a light grade of oil for lubricating or kerosene for lamps. A huge surplus of light grade oil would just ruin that market. And it was on its way out anyway because of electricity. Fortunately, Beaumont oil was a heavy grade oil, ideal to produce industrial fuel. Now, the problem was that there wasn't really yet a market for fuel oil. Industry still ran on coal. So one oil man stated correctly, there will be a good market for fuel oil when the country has had time to adjust itself to using liquid fuel. And ultimately, it was a case of an enormous supply creating a demand. There was, of course, at the first speculation that Gusher was a fluke, that there wasn't any more oil in that salt dome. But 11 weeks later, another Gusher came in, and then 4, and then the rest is history. You saw that other picture a while ago. And this is in a promotional Chamber of Commerce type book from Beaumont at the end of the year. And at first I thought they had doctored that photo because it shows 3 gushers, one of them not even at a derrick. And then I thought, no, they probably were. They might have turned them back on because they've taken the structure off the top of the well. But I don't think they painted them in there, painted the oil gushers in there. Well, history's all about timing. And as I mentioned, electricity was coming in, so illuminating oil was losing. But industry was growing by leaps and bounds, factories, et cetera. And the seemingly unlimited quantities of this heavy grade oil at Spindletop made fuel oil economically feasible. Now, this is an electric car it was the first first automobile in Beaumont, owned by John C. Ward. But it was electric. But the infant automobile industry, which in the beginning impartially powered vehicles with steam, electricity, or gasoline, turned to gasoline, which earlier had been an unwanted byproduct of kerosene refining. So one of those, go figures. So within a year, Spindletop oil was being shipped all over the world. Industry was converting from solid to liquid fuel, railroads, steamships, manufacturing, and airplanes. And that's a ship, of course. Standard Oil also lost its huge monopoly during this time. They had decided not to invest in any of the first wells at the Lucas Gusher, at the Spindletop oil field. But three major oil companies, Texaco, Gulf, Humble, which nobody knows about anymore because all of them have changed their name, but had their beginnings at Spindletop, and Sun Oil became a major company there. Okay, well, there was a ripple effect. And by the end of 1901, gushers had been brought in at Sour Lake, Saratoga, Batson. That's the Texaco Gusher crew that brought in the gusher in Sour Lake. Followed by Humble, 1905, Goose Creek in 1908, and then the search moved inland to fields in central, southeast, North Texas, the Panhandle, and in the 1910s and 20s, the gigantic East Texas field, in 1930. So refining followed the discoveries. By 1903, three refineries were operating near Spindletop, two in Port Arthur and one in Beaumont, and that's the Magnolia Refinery, which is now the ExxonMobil refinery. So by 1917, Texas had 26 refineries, most of them in the Beaumont, Port Arthur area, and then it began to expand down the coast. So the United States entry into World War I increased demand for petrochemicals. And oil prosperity in the 1920s actually kept petrochemical areas from feeling the effects of the Depression for several years. World War II brought more production, of course, for war machinery, the fuel production, and the Big Inch and Little Inch pipelines, which carried crude oil and gasoline from this area to the East Coast. Were completed in 1944. That's a picture of the Big Inch pipeline. It was 24 inches. The Little Inch was 20 inches. So early on, it was established as the fuel for the 20th century. Okay, well, early on, Spindletop acquired a permanent place in popular culture. You have here's an early, you'd call it pulp fiction. Over here, this Secret Service, Old and Young King Brady Detectives, and the title is The Bradys and the Beaumont Oil King, or Three Bad Men from Texas. And you see the derricks in the background, and here are the good guys arresting the two guys and the guy trying to escape through the window who gets caught halfway. Over on the right here is the Lucas Geyser March. They weren't calling it a gusher yet. And it was written by a Beaumonter, Fanny Lamb, and she wrote a march. It's the Lucas Geyser March, and so it was part of the culture of music, pulp fiction, maybe not literature yet, but anyway, it definitely had a hold on the public imagination. And this painting, which today hangs at Beaumont's Terrell Historical Library, tradition says it was commissioned by George W. Carroll. Well, remember I said he was probably the preeminent Baptist in Beaumont. And technically it is titled Spindletop Viewing Her Gusher, here being the gusher. And here she is shading her eyes against the sunrise to see it. That when the painter first did it, Spindletop was unclothed, and George W. Carroll wouldn't stand for that. And so the painter had to go back and put clothes on. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. I guess some analysis could reveal that. But at any rate, it was definitely Carroll's, George W. Carroll, because he was one of the investors in the Gladys City Company. Okay, and here it is. You get what we a long time ago called filling stations. Now they're service stations. up on the left. And I love these little ones that came out in the 20s and 30s when the highway systems began to expand and they would put them along the road. They're just got so much personality. And these are early gas tanks, as you might imagine, where the gasoline actually comes up in the top. And you pump it up there and then you pump it down into your car. And theoretically, you could see what color the gasoline was and recognize the quality by the color of it. And of course, here are the Chevys, just the iconic Chevrolets. And then here's a road map. You had to have road maps because the roads began to connect across state lines. People actually began to drive places instead of taking the trains. So also automobiles became the vehicle of choice for what came to be called dating. Parents now had to worry about what their children were doing while they were in automobiles, especially in the back seat. So the 1901 discovery didn't really provide the whole world with oil. It was, by 1903 or 4, the gushers were no longer gushing. And by the 20s, the field was nearly gone. But by then, there were oil fields all over Texas and other places too. And in 1925, a second Spindletop oil boom came from deep wells drilled on the flanks of the old salt dome. And that's a postcard of that. So what was the significance of Spindletop? As we said, it was the quantity of oil it produced. People had to think up new uses for it. And that changed the world, not just fuel. What about plastics, computers, transportation, space travel? Has it all been good? No. Now we have to deal with pollution, global warming, and energy dependent, and tragedies and disasters occasional. This is a New London explosion where the gas line that ran under the school in New London, Texas, exploded and killed hundreds of children and teachers and everything. And now the big question today is, well, what's going to replace oil? But at any rate, today a small stripper operation still produces small quantities of oil on Spindletop, and it's closed to the public, unfortunately. We were lucky enough to get to go while we were writing the book. But if you could go there, you'd see remnants of old Cypress tanks, and you'd smell the unmistakable smell of crude oil. It's still there. The hill is really now like a crater because sulfur was removed in the 1950s from the dome. And so there's a crater complete with a little lake in the sunken center. The original drill site has been marked with a flag, and it can be seen from an overlook on the outskirts of the old field. And that's the flag. The monument base is there. There was originally, they almost lost the location of the original well, but they finally found it and they marked it with a monument there. But that is the monument that is currently today at Spindletop Gladys City Museum. They moved it because this was not going to be something the public could see. So there can be little argument that Spindletop brought change to the country and the world. In the words of Joe Pratt, who was at the University of Houston and probably the preeminent oil historian and anywhere around, said the oil business in Texas provided the final push needed to convert the United States from a second-tier country at the turn of the 20th century into the biggest superpower of that century. And so he says that's the real legacy of Spindletop. That's just a picture, different pictures of drillers. It's fun. There's a modern crew. And I love this one at the bottom. They've evidently just encountered a gusher and they're soaked with oil it's very obvious. Okay, that's all I have. If anybody's got any questions, I think I went on too long, but I'll be glad to answer any if you got it.
I got one.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of missed part of the first, but did you ever run across the name Griffith?
Griffith, Griffith?
Yeah.
I can't say that I did, but it's been a long time since I wrote the book.
He moved into Brazoria County, but he supposedly made a bunch of his money and so forth. He was one of those doodle buggers, he had some sort of little contraption that he went across the land and told you where to drill.
Yeah,
Spindletop was one of the places he hit.
I'll be. Griffith, huh?
Yeah. You never heard that name. Okay.
No, but that doesn't mean he wasn't there. There were a lot of people there. So he actually, where he said it was going to be, it was.
Do what now?
His divining rod worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had
That's
some sort of
cool.
little contraption that he walked, and I forgot. I had a description of it,
Yeah.
and like I said, he made plenty of money there, and he came over to Missouri County and bought some plantation land outside of West Columbia.
I'll be. And did okay there too? Did he find it?
His family is still descendants are still there.
That's neat.
Yeah.
I'd like to read more about him. Maybe I will. I'm gonna go back and look and see if he appears in any of our research. That's interesting.
Great question, Mr. Smith.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Ladies?
Well, my old friend Ron Strybos, which most of y'all probably don't know, but he worked for Dow for several years, and then he went to Spindletop, and the last few years he passed away.
So
Actually,
he
a
went back.
fairly young guy.
Yeah, he went back to Spindletop and drilled.
Yeah, well, we have he worked on salt domes and things.
Right. That's interesting.
He was drilling salt domes and he went back there to see if he could.
Yeah,
Oil.
there have been, like I say, they've got those little stripper operations, but probably 2015 anyway, years ago, there was a real drilling operation way out on the flanks. I mean, the derrick wasn't anywhere near the crater, the dome, and because of the directional, and also them thinking that it's on the flanks, I guess still, but they showed us a seismograph, one of those 3D seismographs of a formation under there that they said, they really thought still held a lot of oil, and that particular one did not. He didn't. It was a dry hole, but I think there's still a lot of thought that there's more oil there somewhere if they can just get to it. So.
Yeah, my family on my mother's side, this is kind of what they did. They worked for Standard Oil in the 20s and 30s.
Where did they work for Standard? Here or up there? Where Standard?
They started in like Mahia, Texas, and then they were left out. He went down. He lived in Venezuela for Standard. He worked out there for Standard Oil for years and years.
Right. So he went everywhere. Goodness.
Yeah, I got pictures of him with Amelia Earhart as she flew into a landing strip there down in Venezuela, and they refueled Standard Oil, refueled her and everything.
Oh, that's neat! What a great story.
Pretty cool, James.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much for the presentation and your time and effort.
You are welcome.
And we should give her a hand. Ready? Everybody go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We normally do give our speakers something, so I'll get
you fed me supper. That's plenty. I sang for my supper.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, I've been recording this and it'll be out there. I'll try to edit it best I can. And so you're welcome to go out to our not our website, but our wide area on YouTube. And you ought to be able to see the last 4 or 5 presentations. Actually, 9 presentations, excuse me. Okay, with that said, thanks for coming to the meeting, guys and gals,
Thank you for having me.
and we will see you at field school.
Right.
Right. All right. See you later.
Uh,
Mm,
All right,
Bye-bye.
good night.
Right. That's. You have to chase it.
Oh, it is. Okay, so if I